The Ontario government legislates against education workers. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The Ontario government, led by Doug Ford, has passed legislation that would impose a contract on education workers and levy hefty fines for striking. Now, this comes after many unsuccessful negotiations between the Education Workers Union and the Ontario government. We'll get to these specifics in a little bit, but there is a preamble I want to offer here. First of all, it was wrong when Justin Trudeau used the Emergencies Act to curb the trucker convoy. It's also wrong when Doug Ford uses the notwithstanding clause to curb contract negotiations between his government and a union. As Canadians, we have fundamental rights in this country. Those rights include the right to protest and to negotiate peacefully, as we wish. The Canadian government seems to have lost its mind here. These recent attempts to squash our freedoms are deplorable. I condemn both circumstances. Now, we also have to say, there is a distinction here that by keeping it in mind, this whole conversation will flow a lot more smoothly. We're talking about the citizenry's right to partake in protest and negotiation. Forget about the actual contents of those protests and negotiations for a second. You may think that the unions are being greedy. More power to you. We can discuss that. Maybe you're right, maybe you're not. But you're free to oppose what the unions are seeking. That's perfectly fine. What we're talking about, though, is the right to not have the government force a contract on them, as if we're in some sort of draconian regime. At the very least, in a free country, people should have the right to bargain regarding their terms of employment, and they should have the right to reject terms they find unfavorable, even if the government is that employer. Now, the same principle applies to the trucker convoy, too. You may oppose everything they stand for. I've criticized them heavily before. That's fine. But it's once again a separate topic. We need to protect each other's rights even if we don't like how other people are using them. That's the most important time to protect them. The same logic applies to concepts like free speech as well. I may dislike what you have to say. I may disagree with what you have to say. But I'll protect your right to say it. And I have other ways of dealing with a disagreement. We can debate. We can talk about it. I can simply ignore you. There are many more productive tools in the toolkit that don't hand total autonomy over to the government. It's always a mistake to do that. Now, back to the specific situation here between the education workers and the Doug Ford government. The Ford government used the notwithstanding clause to pass this legislation. Now, many people would say, I thought it was illegal to stop a union or employees from negotiating. Well, that is for the most part true, but the notwithstanding clause has quite a lot of power. So, that's actually Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedom, and it gives the provincial legislatures of Parliament the ability, through the passage of law, to override certain portions of the Charter for a 5-year term. So, in other words, even if the Charter guarantees you the right to negotiate, for example, this clause says that the government can say no if they pass a law that determines that. And they can do this for up to 5 years. So, if you have a freedom, the provincial government can say, I'm going to invoke the notwithstanding clause and strike it down. Now, of course, that's a lot of power, and it was intended to be used in times of emergency. This clearly is not that. And also, this situation mirrors the trucker convoy a lot. The Emergencies Act, it's in the name. It was supposed to be used for an emergency. Was that one? It's highly debatable. Now, to be perfectly honest, I'm not a fan of the notwithstanding clause. I think it's more dangerous than helpful, even in a time of emergency. But moving on, The Guardian reports that this legislation that was passed would fine school support staff $4,000 a day, Canadian dollars, for striking. That's quite a bit. I'm sure that's more than they make a day usually. And that's promoting concerns that Ontario is eroding fundamental workers' rights, which they are, and setting a troubling precedent, which they are. And what's that precedent? Well, if you anger the government, they can squash you. I can't take that. We have to fight back against this nonsense. I condemn Doug Ford and his government for this harebrained idea. And once again, that's separate from agreeing that the education support staff should get something like a 12% raise. We can debate the merits of that separately. Simply now, we're talking about people's fundamental rights, and those have to be safeguarded. Now, although this is a provincial matter, federal politicians are also chiming in. Justin Trudeau has sharply criticized Doug Ford and his decision to suspend people's rights and freedoms. Now, once again, I find that both accurate and comical. So first of all, I too also criticize Doug Ford's decision here. But second, Trudeau criticizing a government's decision to suspend people's rights and freedoms, as if he didn't just do that a couple months back. The irony is strong here, and I hope people are recognizing that. This type of hypocrisy is something I hate to see at the governmental level. They should have fundamental moral pillars and standards. If Trudeau is saying that something like people's rights and freedoms are things to not be meddled with, then uphold that across the board. Even when you don't like it, when people are using those freedoms in ways that you don't support. Really what I'm hearing is they support people's rights and freedoms as long as they like the topic. And that's no standard. It's very similar to those who say they like free speech but only speech that they approve of, or those who like diversity but only diversity that goes in the way that they approve of, or those who say that they're all about showing compassion but only to those they care about. Those are false standards, and they might confuse people into thinking there's something that they're not. These are not champions of human rights. They're hypocrites. Now, to close off, here's the fundamental wedge between the two parties, the government and the union. The Canadian Union of Public Employees, which represents about 55,000 education workers, has called for an 11.3% raise for its workers. And they're saying that's often for the lowest paid in schools, such as the support workers. And they argue that stagnant wage growth and high inflation have hit these low earners the hardest. The government has countered with an offer of a 2.5% annual raise for those low-income workers and 1.5% for others. So that is indeed quite a delta, from 11% to 2.5%. How do we bridge the gap? Well, we'll have to see. It seems like right now we are in quite a standoff. So the Ford government said we're going to use the notwithstanding clause to force a contract on you and to stop you from striking. But the union said we're going to use a not listening clause to just continue with our strike. And yes, I did see that joke on Reddit. I forget who posted it now, but it was quite funny. Notwithstanding versus not listening. Where do we go from here? Well, if we escalate further, the Ford government will impose those fines they talked about, $4,000 a day per person who strikes, and the union, I believe, will be fined $500,000. That's quite a lot, and it will be crippling. Now, what could the union do in that case? Well, they could say, we're not going to pay it. Then what do you do? Well, logically the next step is to involve law enforcement, and either take them to court or find ways to throw them in jail, basically, for breaking the law. And that would be even a further descent down this radical slope that we're on. Now, I do believe it's unlikely the Ford government agrees to this 11% wage hike, especially because they've gone through all this trouble so far, and things like the sunken cost fallacy are probably weighing on them. And on the flip side, I think it's unlikely the union agrees to this 2.5% increase. The most likely situation is going to be a compromise, somewhere in the middle. Whether that's more on the government side or more on the union side, that remains to be seen. Now, as always, I'll keep you up to date on the latest on the situation. And with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. It'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.